So if you can hear like plane crashes and loud noises, it's because my husband's watching Top Gun in the other room. But welcome back to my channel. This is the second week of my reading update that I've decided to document, and I will be talking about two books that I finished and two books that I got from the library. So the two books that I got from the library, I haven't started, but let me quickly show them to you. I really don't know what they're about except that I've just heard about them and they sounded interesting. The first one is called How to Do Nothing: Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. I saw this on a list of like Obama's favorite books a few years ago, and I was kind of intrigued because it kind of teaches you to be like present and more mindful in the age of social media, because we're constantly like bombarded with information, and then there's like 1,000 apps that you have to keep a track of, and there's constantly like information that you have to pay attention to, and it kind of reduces your attention span over the years. So this one I picked up. I did listen to like the introduction on audiobook, but I realized very quickly that this is one of those books that the audiobook will lose me very quickly. I'll start zoning out, so I have to read it with a little more concentration. The next book is a fiction book called The Down Days by Ilse Hugo. Ilse Hugo is a South African author, and this book, I'm not gonna lie, I'm quite shallow. I picked it up just for the cover, and it's basically a fiction book which talks about a pandemic somewhere in Africa where people are infected with a laughing disease. And it came out like during the pandemic, so it has like some similarities. Again, I haven't fully read it, or I haven't even started it, so I don't really know where the similarity starts and where it ends. But basically, it talks about the disease, and there is this one person, Faith, who we follow, and she's basically a full-time corpse collector, and she is trying to like put pieces of the disease together to try to solve like what it is and figure out where the problem is and how it can be solved. So this one seemed pretty interesting, and I'll give it a go. Again, if it's not something that I like, I'll definitely put it down, because I'm getting really, really good at DNFing books. Now to talk about the books that I finished. I finished Africa Is Not a Country by Dipo Philoyen. He is a Nigerian author, and this book is a collection of essays about the continent of Africa. And I give this book 5 stars. It was an incredible book. It was really, really well written. The writing was super palatable. The author exercises like humor and sarcasm while telling these stories, and it documents like a bunch of different issues, um, starting from the colonization of Africa and the effects of decolonization on the African political system. The European countries who colonized Africa used the concept of divide and rule, which created a lot of differences, which unfortunately are not even resolved up until this day. The book also talks about like the whole aid and charity culture and how harmful it is essentially for the African countries to be seen as war torn, diseased, constantly needing help, and not being able to really rule or govern themselves because they're just poor and somebody else has to help them. There's also like an element of media representation and how the West has portrayed Africa in so many countries, and all of them are extremely offensive and really, really poor. And just how, like, you can really make a blockbuster which will have nothing to do with real African representation, and it's going to win an Oscar. um, there were other topics mentioned about like the stolen treasures of Africa, how the colonizers basically looted, pillaged, destroyed complete countries to steal the treasures, and there's no attempt of giving them back because they're just sitting in like museums across the world and making them look good, or rather giving them back to the countries where they were stolen from. It talks about activism, youth activists, different movements, and currently what is going on in Africa. And I really like this book. I would highly recommend you to pick it up and definitely give it a go. And the other book that I finished was called Harlots, Whores, and Hackabouts by Kate Lister. This is basically a book about the history of sex work. And for one, I really liked it. I give it 4 stars, and I was kind of going between the audiobook and the physical book. And one thing that I experienced with the physical book was I don't have it with me anymore because I've given it back to the library. But I found it a bit distracting to read because there were a lot of diagrams and pictures, and it kind of like took you out of the flow of the reading, because you'd be reading something and then you're distracted by a diagram and a caption, and by the time you get to the next page, you forgot what you were reading about because you're paying attention to all of these other little elements. And I feel like that's not really a shortcoming because it kind of shows how much work and research you put into the book. But for me, it was one of those things that kind of took me a bit out of the physical book, so I mostly relied on the audiobook to finish it. And again, this was a great book. It's not some salacious material about like reading about sex work and kind of it's not eroticizing anything, but it's a compassionate look at the sex work, what drove it. Like most of these people, men and women who resorted to sex work, were definitely going through something. The state was failing them in some way. They were very, very poor with no means of supporting themselves, and the government was not really able to help them, so they resorted to these means. But it also talks about like how being in sex work can actually empower some of these women, because it kind of gave them more rights than the normal people. And it kind of shows you a perspective of how sex work originated in different parts of the world, how women were exploited during wars. Like, I was very, very surprised to hear that there were brothels during the war, Second World War, that were on the concentration camps, and they were basically for non-Jewish prisoners to go to. So it was kind of like a very compassionate, insightful look into the sex work industry, and it's definitely one area that you can't look at as it's not black and white. Like, it's not a moral issue that people need to take upon themselves and decide for themselves. So it also shows a very nuanced perspective of the men and women who are doing this kind of work, but it's also the women who were dealing with the brunt of the issue, because they were the one who were most criminalized, because the women are selling sex and the men are buying it, but guess who's getting more punished? It's not the men. And who's facing the consequences? It's definitely the women. So yeah, overall, like, a great insightful book, and again, I give it 4 stars. One that I would also recommend. Just be aware that it has a lot of like pictures and information that you might not want to be seen reading in public. That's just one thing that I would be wary of, but I would also say that the audiobook worked better for me. So this is the update for this week, and I'll keep you posted on how I do on the other 2 books, if I start reading them, if I DNF them, if I finish them, and I'll tell you about them next week. So thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Bye.